This is the Nintendo Switch 2, and after using this over the last 2 weeks, I've been pleasantly surprised by this console. I think we all kind of expect Nintendo to push out underpowered consoles at this point that focus more on first-party games and the overall experience, but I think the upgrades that they've put into the Switch 2 do make it a lot more competitive when it comes to hardware, and on top of that, there is some great innovation in here. That being said, it's not without its faults, and if you're looking to pick one of these up, there are some things that you should be aware of. So with that said, let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. I've been a huge fan of Nintendo ever since the NES, which is probably dating me quite a bit, but in my eyes, Nintendo has always been known for making great games and experiences, and maybe not so much on the hardware side of things. The Wii and the Switch are both good examples of this. Both consoles sold amazingly well and offered great experiences and innovation without the latest and greatest in terms of graphics. And the Switch 2 kind of follows that same blueprint, but I think this go around, you're probably making less sacrifices than in previous generations, and you're getting some great new features that you won't find anywhere else, and that all starts with the design. The Switch 2 is much bigger than its predecessor at 4.5 inches tall, 10.7 inches wide, but keeps the same thickness at 0.55 inches, and weighs in at 1.18 pounds with the Joy-Con controllers. So it's definitely not the lightest in the world, but holding it does feel much more comfortable than the Switch 1. Now, it's still nowhere near as comfortable as holding a nice controller, but the Switch 2 is much more natural feeling in my hands, and the buttons and joysticks are both bigger than the previous gen, which are closer to matching traditional full-sized controls that you would see on a standard controller. The way that those Joy-Con controllers connect to the tablet has also changed, with a much nicer magnetic attachment system that clips in and can be released with a button next to the top triggers, versus the old style that would just slide into place. This new style seems a lot less prone to wear, and my only reservation with wear is with the joysticks themselves, where Nintendo chose to use potentiometer joysticks that are prone to stick drift over time, and these aren't cheap at $95 US a pop. That being said, everything else about these is fantastic. Holding them individually away from the tablet, again, feels much better than the first generation, where you do get better haptics with Rumble HD 2 that has much better granular feedback. And you get some pretty neat features like using either Joy-Con as a mouse. That can be done by standing either Joy-Con on its edge, and it'll work on almost any surface. I have to admit, when I first saw this feature, I thought, what the hell am I going to use a mouse for? But it's actually been quite useful in games that have initially been designed for use with a mouse. And using the Joy-Cons this way does feel surprisingly smooth, where it's not really that far off from using a regular mouse. I think those are all great additions to the Switch, and where Nintendo has probably made the biggest leaps in terms of the overall design, but the thing that I want to get into is the screen, which is the reason why the device itself is so big, and I do have mixed feelings about it. First of all, the 7.9-inch display is much nicer to look at over the old 6.2-inch one in the original Switch. Everything is just a tad more viewable, especially in games that maybe weren't meant for smaller screens, but the panel itself could be a bit better in my opinion. That is a 1080p IPS LCD display, and it does have some decent specs on it, like a 120Hz variable refresh rate and HDR10 support, but even for an IPS panel, it does lack in some areas like brightness, where you will see a max brightness between 400 and 450 nits in SDR, and a touch higher in HDR, which is pretty lackluster. Especially where this is a portable console, I would have liked to see that brightness level at 500 or 600 nits, because that would make this a lot more viewable outdoors. And right now, you can still use it in bright areas okay, but it will struggle when there's a lot of sunlight. And because the brightness isn't much higher in HDR, and the black levels are elevated compared to an OLED panel, darker HDR content can sometimes appear washed out or hard to see. Other than that though, things look pretty good where the colors are decent, and unlike the previous gen where titles like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom could be a little bit janky at times, everything is now buttery smooth, and a lot of that has to do with what's inside the Switch 2. Within here is a custom NVIDIA Tegra T239 system on a chip that has an Ampere GPU with 1536 CUDA cores and has 12 gigs of RAM, which is up from 4 in the Switch 1. It also supports ray tracing and DLSS, and all things considered, for a handheld console, feels pretty powerful. Like I said, the Zelda games run a lot smoother, and they also run at higher resolutions and frame rates with the enhanced editions. The Switch 2 is backwards compatible with a bunch of regular Switch games, but enhanced versions of games can cost around $10 USD, or a little less depending on the game, but those all run great, as do the day one titles like Mario Kart World, which is to be expected. The thing that really surprised me was that ports like Cyberpunk 2077 play amazingly well, and graphically look very much the same as other console versions, which was kind of unexpected. I thought that game specifically would likely be toned down a little more, but that has been fantastic, where I don't really feel like I'm missing out on anything in terms of graphics or gameplay. Now, if you're someone who likes the social aspect of gaming, the Switch 2 does have a brand new C button on the console that launches Game Chat. That will work with any game and can support 4 video feeds and 12 people total per lobby, and you can chat in and out of games. For video to work, you'll either have to buy Nintendo's own Switch 2 camera or find a compatible third-party one or a proper capture card. I've not had much luck testing out the webcams that I've got around here, which is fine as I'm not huge into video chat. If you'd rather do audio only, the Switch 2 does have built-in mics that work quite well, and those are designed for using at a distance. So you'll get things like voice isolation and noise reduction that are built in if you want to use the Switch 2 propped up on a surface or in the dock. That being said, to get any of this chat functionality, you will need a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, where the basic version costs $20 USD for the year. Not a huge amount by any means, but I am a little disappointed with some of Nintendo's pricing structure. I know the games themselves are expensive compared to other consoles, but I'm honestly fine with that. Game prices haven't increased in decades, and I'm okay with it if it's supporting the people who make them. I just wish things like HD packs for existing games like Zelda were maybe free or a tad cheaper, and the Switch 2 Welcome Tour should probably be free. On top of that, the new micro SD cards are super expensive, and just a note on these, not just any micro SD card will work in here. You've got to use a micro SD Express card that has an extra set of pins. I believe I read somewhere that someone is working on an adapter that would make these little 2230 NVMe drives usable, but these little 256 gig cards will cost you over $50 right now, and the Pro controllers are much more expensive than most controllers, so the costs can add up pretty quickly here, but it is nice that the regular Switch Pro controllers still work. That's what I use the majority of the time while docked, and the dock itself I would say is probably the cheapest part of this setup. It does look a bit better than the Switch 1 dock, with it having rounded corners, but the plastic feels quite flimsy, and I wish the actual docking aspect felt a little more secure. Right now it just kind of falls into place like the Switch 1, where having some kind of magnets like the Joy-Con controllers would make this feel a lot more tactile and secure. And with this being a bit bigger, it may also be nice to have a horizontal docking option. As far as ports go on that dock, you've got an HDMI out, a USB-C power, Ethernet, and 2 USB-A ports, which is one less than the Switch 1 dock, but the increased size does accommodate for an active cooling system within the dock, with fans that cool the Switch 2 when you're playing hooked up to a TV. As far as the heat goes, handheld you can definitely feel a bit of warmth. Nothing that I'd be overly concerned with, but when you hook this up to a TV, if you're running this at 1440p or 4K resolutions, the Switch 2 does need to run at higher clock speeds, which in turn produces a lot more heat. And the dock does do an effective job cooling it, where the fans stay relatively quiet while running, but there is something worth noting when connected to a TV. Docked, the Switch 2 will support 4K gaming at 60 frames per second or 1440p at 120 FPS, and you will get HDR support, but due to the limitations on the USB port in the bottom of the console, you will lose the variable refresh rate you get on the tablet. That bottom USB-C port will be used for your dock and charging handheld, but this new generation has added a USB-C port at the top of the device for charging as well, or connecting accessories. And if you're using this handheld, you're gonna need to charge this a lot because the battery life isn't great. Nintendo says that you'll get between 2 and 6.5 hours on a single charge, where in my own testing, I found that to be almost always between 2.5 and 3 hours. For instance, if I play through a Mario Kart World circuit, that generally eats up just under a quarter of the battery, and more demanding games like Cyberpunk will drain it even faster, so it's worth having a battery bank with you if you're gonna be away from a wall outlet for a while. When it does come time to charge, the Switch 2 will take roughly 3.5 hours to go from 0 to 100%, and Nintendo does have an option where you can set a charge limit to extend your battery health. I think I would be more inclined to do that if the battery life was similar to the original Switch that could last a couple more hours, but where I only get a few hours out of this, I'll be leaving that as is. All things considered, I do really like the Switch 2. The games that I've tried have worked flawlessly, the console itself has been solid and feels well built, and my only minor complaints are with the dock feeling a bit flimsy, the battery life, and with some of the pricing structure. The costs can really add up on this console between the games and the accessories, where at least on something like a Steam Deck, you've got access to an existing library if you're playing on a PC, and the games can often be a lot cheaper as well. I am going to try and get my hands on that new ROG Xbox Alloy X, and I may do a comparison between them when I do, so stay tuned for that, but I would love to know. Now that the handheld market is maturing a bit, and you've got a lot more options out there, is the Switch 2 on your radar, or would you rather use something else that plays Steam or Xbox titles? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all I got for you today. I hope you found this video useful or enjoyable. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content, or help me build a handheld console that ends your game every time you blink, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.